Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. It's pretty exciting to be at our sixth, that's kind of hard to believe, sixth annual SU Research Day. This is where we come together and highlight some of our outstanding faculty and their scholarly activities. So it's meant to be celebratory in nature and also meant to be academic in nature. And so we appreciate all of you being here, students, staff, faculty, everyone. It's a great time to kind of celebrate what we do outside of the classroom as well as the activities that we do that support our faculty and staff and their scholarly activities. For those of you that don't know the voice or the face, I'm Clifton Griffin, Dean of Grad Studies and Research here at SU. Lots of folks in our office have been a part of the logistics of setting this up, so I'm very appreciative of the staff of Grad Studies and Research for all of their activities today and the last few days to get us started. I do want to say thank you to our president, Dr. Chuck White, for making it. I know he's rushed here from a Board of Regents, a thrilling Board of Regents experience, and so we appreciate you being here, Chuck. Thank you very much. Also want to say a big shout out and thanks and appreciation for our interim provost and senior vice president, Dr. Karen Olmstead, huge advocate and supporter of research at all levels from faculty to grad students to undergraduates. So thank you all for being here for sure. So to keep us on time, I'm going to hush, which is the hardest thing I ever do, and we'll get started with our first presentation from the Department of History, Fulton School of Liberal Arts. Is Dr. Dr Gonzalez going to speak about the clarity of vision, black activist in the anti-slavery movement.
Well, thank you very much to the organizers and the supporters of today's Research Day. This paper comes from my book manuscript, which is entitled Visualizing Equality, African American Champions of Race, Rights, and Visual Culture. And the manuscript argues that African American activists produced visual material to advance campaigns for black rights and racial equality during the middle decades of the 19th century. So on the night of March 16, 1852, more than 100 men, women, and children crowded into an exhibition hall in Wolverhampton, England. After they paid the entrance fee and took their seats, an assistant drew back a curtain to reveal a massive plane of painted canvas stretched taut between two moving cylindrical wheels. Lamps illuminated the moving panorama from behind, while in front, audience members saw a sheet of canvas which stood between 8 and 12 feet tall and extended for over 1,000 feet long. Over the course of the night, their formerly enslaved host used the 46 separate painted views depicted on the canvas to describe the horrors of the Middle Passage and recount his own enslavement in Virginia. Both the range and the subjects covered that night, from, quote, gorgeous scenery of the West India Islands to enslaved people burning alive, amazed and horrified many of the attendees. They may have taken solace knowing that some of the proceeds of their admission fee were to be used to purchase freedom for the enslaved wife and children of the host, Henry Box Brown. Now, Henry Box Brown was one of several African Americans who turned to the medium of the moving panorama as an anti-slavery device during the 1850s. William Wells Brown, a formerly enslaved man, decided to create a moving panorama to counter depictions of slavery in another moving panorama he deemed very mild. He collected entrance fees and donations and directed them to the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society and the American Anti-Slavery Society. Henry Box Brown wrote that he exhibited his work in order to raise funds to purchase the freedom of his enslaved wife and children. Right, so I'm moving here left to right. James Presley Ball toured his moving panorama of anti-slavery content to raise awareness of slavery's brutalities. Anthony Burns, the man famous for being convicted of being a fugitive slave in Boston in 1854, also exhibited a panorama of slavery. But historical records documenting his project are extremely scarce, so I'm not focusing on them today. Instead, if we pay attention to the previous three activist panoramas, we'll find that they reveal that Black abolitionists used strategies to advance the anti-slavery cause to thousands of people in Ohio, Massachusetts, and the British Isles. This paper very briefly examines these three works exhibited by the three men here on the screen. And together we'll discover how each used the medium of the anti-slavery moving panorama to make central the experiences of enslaved people. So first, a bit of background about the visual work. Having existed since the late 18th century, it enjoyed a vigorous revival in Europe and the United States during the 1840s, primarily as a way to view distant lands, famous events, and religious scenes. During the same era, many Black abolitionists grew dissatisfied with white abolitionists' paternalism and restriction of Black activists from leadership positions. Moving within the circles of very well-established anti-slavery societies in New York and in Boston, Henry Box Brown and William Wells Brown transformed this moving panorama into a new abolitionist strategy to center their own experiences of enslavement. Riding the swell of this newly renewed popularity in the moving panorama, Box Brown, Wells Brown, and J.P. Ball toured their works that sought to motivate their audiences. So first viewed by the public in April of 1850, Henry Box Brown's moving panorama, titled The Mirror of Slavery, commemorated his own experience of slavery to aid the freedom of his wife and children. He explained, quote, "I travel in the free states and denounce slavery and slaveholders. I appeal to the public for assistance to buy my wife and children. I obtain the money. I offer it. I am refused." End quote. While Box Brown most immediately envisioned his panorama to produce these funds to free his family members, he also urgently demanded the end of slavery as an institution nationwide. Box Brown provided audiences with a thorough view of the social, the economic, and the historical contexts of slavery. So this included his own experiences as an enslaved man. His rise to fame had been meteoric after he escaped slavery in a wooden box that was shipped from Virginia to Philadelphia abolitionists in 1849. He gave lectures that captivated audiences about his story of self-emancipation, but also shared his experiences with the thousands who purchased his escaped slave narrative, which was first published in 1849 as well. Known to be a showman who often reenacted his flight from slavery before crowds by emerging from this wooden box, Box Brown decided to give Bostonians something they had never seen before, a moving panorama that highlighted the brutalities of slavery as he experienced them. So his aptly named panorama, the Mirror of Slavery, convinced some attendees of the injustices of slavery. So one reviewer in a newspaper underscored the transformative possibility of Brown's work. Quote, "We would urge our readers to visit this panorama, and if any of them have thought lightly of the injustice done by America to 3.5 million of our fellow creatures, we feel assured that they will leave the exhibition in another frame of mind." End quote. The editor's faith that witnessing the work would provide them and provoke them to reconsider slavery in the U.S. revealed the extent to which anti-slavery visual culture was thought to compel people to identify slavery's inherent injustice. Other reviewers raved that Brown's work could invigorate and advance the anti-slavery cause in ways that lecturers and other anti-slavery strategies had not before. Quote, "From the opinion of persons who have encouraged this moral and instructive diorama, this exhibition, if wisely conducted," one reporter wrote, "will create more in favor of philanthropy than a legion of such anti-slavery lecturers." After all, abolitionists, especially formerly enslaved African Americans, traveled to the British Isles. Frederick Douglass does this, for example, in the 1840s. The Crafts do this as well. And they do this to engender anti-slavery activism and international pressure through their peripatetic lecturing. Though activists had long visited Europe to elicit this kind of support, the uptick in Black transatlantic activism marked a powerful change and method of authenticating Black self-representation to an international community. So part of the persuasive power of Box Brown's panorama rested in its ability to educate in multiple disciplines and educate multiple audiences. The landscape scenery marked one important subject about which audiences could learn. Quote, "The young, especially, should not neglect the opportunity to attend the panorama," wrote one journalist, "as they may derive more information from the impressive scenery than they can do from the perusal of many works written on the subject," end quote. The power of personal testimony and visual education was on display. Brown encouraged the attendance of children by offering them half-price admission in several towns, and also advertised that, quote, "the scholars and the teachers of Sunday schools would be admitted by special arrangement." As one attendee wrote, "There are other sources of interest replete with lessons of instruction that Brown provided to children and adults alike." All had the opportunity to hear and to see the experiences of the African slave trade and slavery in the United States, narrated by a formerly enslaved man. The scale of Box Brown's education efforts, it's remarkable. One scholar has estimated that Henry Box Brown exhibited his mirror of slavery as many as 2,000 times. So it's probable that many tens of thousands of people viewed his moving scenes of slavery. William Wells Brown. He envisioned his moving panorama that detailed his experiences also as a formerly enslaved man, to have educational, but especially corrective, messages about slavery. You see, inspiration struck him when he attended a panorama of the Mississippi River shown in Boston during the autumn of 1847. He wrote, quote, "I was somewhat amazed at the very mild manner in which the peculiar institution of the Southern states was thus represented, and it occurred to me that a painting with as fair a representation of American slavery could be given upon canvas would do much to disseminate such truth upon this subject and hasten the downfall of the greatest evil that now stains the character of the American people," end quote. So Wells Brown had attended the famous work created by John Banvard that had attracted more than a quarter million Bostonians in 1847 and turned a profit of approximately $50,000, which was an incredible sum in the late 1840s. The descriptive booklet that accompanied his work described its sole mention of enslaved people and its several views of plantations with romanticized and superlative language. The, quote, "splendid sugar plantations of Louisiana, the planters living in, quote, romantically situated Natchez, Mississippi, and a, quote, view of a plantation with all of its busy and cheerful accompaniments," proved problematic for William Wells Brown. So responding to these romanticized and very mild depictions of slavery, Brown devised a plan. His own moving panorama would center the experiences of enslaved people and specifically draw on his own experiences as an enslaved man. He inverted the medium's characteristic focus from landscape to Black bodies and enslavement. Instead of physically small and rhetorically tangential enslaved figures, nearly all of Wells Brown's 24 scenes centered on and emphasized the brutalities that enslaved people experienced. His moving scenes greatly deviated from this genre, the landscape genre, upon which it was based, and he negotiated what his audiences saw. He instructed them on how they should see it, and they directed them on ways to take action to change it. So while the current location of these scenes is unknown, the surviving explanatory booklet that accompanied it detailed Wells Brown's corrective vision. In it, he divulged the strategies he intentionally used to heighten the believability of these scenes, many of which he implied were so horrific that they could be taken as exaggerations or even fabrications. To counter the doubt he anticipated, Brown testified to the truths of the panorama when he wrote in the booklet of the many scenes that I myself have witnessed. He interwove his first-hand testimony of his nearly 20 years of enslavement with the scenes in front of his audiences. In taking this approach, he strategized to affirm and reaffirm the credibility of its content. So he supported his own claims of authenticity by writing that, quote, "The truthfulness of all of them," that is the scenes, "is well known to those who are familiar with the anti-slavery literature of America," end quote, thereby invoking other abolitionist material to shore up the information he displayed and described. So he displayed these scenes that actually came from 2 editions of his autobiography that were published in London. These editions included 3 full-page images that depicted traumatic events in his life that had not been featured in the original 1847 autobiography that he had published. Right, so one edition in Boston and then 2 later in London. The first image from this autobiography closely matched the description of his panorama's 12th scene, in which Brown escaped from slave catchers' dogs by taking refuge in a tree. Scholar Michael Chaney notes that Brown's position in the tree recalled the image of the supplicant slave, that is the kneeling slave, made popular by a Britishman, Josiah Wedgwood, in the 1780s. The symbols of the kneeling slave, the slave catcher's dogs, and the slave catcher himself, riding on horseback, tapped into decades of anti-slavery visual imagery, right? And it was legible to audiences. The second image showed Wells Brown escorting a coffle of slaves to the New Orleans slave market by the slave trader James Walker. The next scene featured the same group of slaves chained and driven past the nation's capital. And the booklet instructed its viewers, and the readers of the booklet, but the viewers of this panorama, to contemplate, quote, "the hypocrisy or gross inconsistency of politicians making speeches and passing resolutions in favor of republicanism in France while supporting slavery in the United States," end quote. The third image depicted Wells Brown and his fugitive mother's recapture. So Brown recorded that this view, quote, "shows that a fugitive slave has no security whatever, that he will not be returned to his owner until he shall succeed in escaping to Canada or some other territory over which the United States government has no control," end quote. Indeed, the panorama ended as a community of escaped slaves in Buffalo, New York, assisted a fugitive family to freedom in Canada. In the booklet description, Brown then directly appealed to his audiences, quote, "You have now accompanied the fugitive amidst perils by land and by perils over water, from his dreary bondage in the Republican Egypt of the United States to the river Niagara. You must now imagine yourselves as having crossed that river and as standing with the slave upon the soil over which the mild scepter of Queen Victoria extends. That scepter not merely more than the emblem of regal authority, then of freedom and protection to the persecuted slave," end quote. So Brown explicitly directed his readers to imagine themselves as having vicariously participated in their flight to freedom. Brown then encouraged audience members to imagine, quote, "a white man, an Englishman, who is extending his hand to his colored friends, giving them at the time the comforting assurance that on British soil they are safe from the hunters of men," end quote. Encouraged to see elements of themselves in the figures aiding African Americans, audiences were then beseeched to give money, to give aid to the anti-slavery cause. Brown requested that audiences donate goods to be sold at the annual anti-slavery bazaar to raise money, but he also was encouraging them to donate money that would pay for anti-slavery lectures, public meetings, and publications. He provided a list of women in 28 cities spread across England, Ireland, and Scotland who had volunteered to collect funds for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, its annual Anti-Slavery Bazaar, and the American Anti-Slavery Society. So only a few years after William Wells Brown and Henry Box Brown began exhibiting their panoramas, another African-American man named James Presley Ball exhibited his moving scenes of slavery. A booklet explained the 53 scenes in his panorama and revealed that Ball penned the booklet, quote, thinking that the lessons sought to be inculcated by him could be further enforced by a collection of the facts upon which it is based, end quote. So he first exhibits in Cincinnati in 1855, which is a hotbed of anti-slavery activism, but it's also the city where Freeborn Ball was best known for his successful Daguerrean galleries, Daguerrean meaning early photography studios. And his panorama garnered much acclaim. He was one of the richest men in the entire city of Cincinnati based on his Daguerrean gallery's success. And the moving panorama traveled to Cleveland and then to Boston, where advertisements billed its views of urban life, its landscape scenery, and its toxic slavery as extraordinary, right, as extraordinary views. So these scenes are described as many beauties that prompted some members of the public to attend, and that was a recurring reason to support free and enslaved African Americans. One reviewer in Boston challenged everyone to see it, quote, especially all such as claim to be friends of the colored race, end quote. Another reviewer remarked that those wishing to assist in elevating a despised and oppressed race should attend the panorama, end quote. An article in The Liberator, the very famous anti-slavery newspaper, pointed out that the exhibition of Ball's work coincided with the anniversary events of the New England Anti-Slavery Society, right? So there's the theme here in terms of motivating individuals to give money to the anti-slavery cause. As one reviewer desired, quote, all who claim to take an interest in the development of genius, talent, and moral worth on the part of free colored people, end quote, should view the work. So like Box Brown and Wells Brown, Ball laid bare the realities of slavery, but from an economic and a much more foreboding perspective. Views of cotton, right, sugar, tobacco, and corn cultivation, as well as detailed explanations of enslaved labor, filled the pages of its descriptive booklet. Ball advanced the visual and textual argument that slavery had secured the nation's economic success, but that slavery would inevitably be the nation's downfall if it was not first abolished. He described the moral depravity wrought by slavery when describing white men's lust for enslaved women and the tentacles of slavery returning north with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Quote, that accursed institution of slavery, Ball wrote, blunted the American conscience, sapped its manhood, and would result in a violent upheaval that would destroy the country and leave it a shapeless mass of wreck and rubbish, end quote, right? This is pretty powerful language from this anti-slavery activist. And his prescient warning of the destruction wrought by the Civil War proved correct. So in the decisions made by these three black men, we have seen how activists identified the stakes of racial representation in visual culture, especially during the 1850s, right, the decade before the Civil War. As cultural producers who identified the moving panorama as yet another tool in the abolitionist arsenal used to destroy slavery, they expanded and they refined discourses of race in the antebellum United States. So when not correcting the inaccuracies in popular depictions of enslavement by speaking their own truth to power, they identified the central role of enslaved people in the foundational structures of the nation. They retooled this medium of the moving panorama and thereby enabled themselves to express their own narratives of slavery and freedom. Each of their works stress the urgency to end slavery for the sake of enslaved people and for the sake of our nation. Thank you.
What remains of the tableaus themselves? Are they preserved anywhere? Have you had the chance to see them?
So none of these three I know to exist, though it's very interesting. In the past 10 years, there have been a number of these moving panoramas, some of them about the whaling expeditions off the New England coastline, have appeared, or rather been dusted off, from the basements of archives, libraries, and other institutions, and there are several that are now being refurbished and displayed to the public. So there's one, for example, that's being displayed right now at the St. Louis Museum in Missouri. So this is all to say that I hold out hope that some of these will see the light of day, because it's true that there are a number of these that are just being rediscovered 150 years after they were toured, some of them nationwide, and they were incredibly popular, so it's not surprising that they would have been saved. And I have, related to these three moving panoramas, I have found a newspaper advertisement for one of them that is to be sold. So there was a black abolitionist who purchased James Presley Ball's, his moving panorama, and then tries to sell it, right? He advertises for it in an anti-slavery newspaper. So my hope is it's out there, that all of these are out there. So it's a great question.
I'm curious to know if Lincoln or Ulysses S. Grant or anyone involved in the Civil War actually saw one of these panoramas, and if there's any record of it influencing their thinking.
I don't know if the national leaders that we associate with the Civil War witnessed these particular moving panoramas, though I would not be surprised if many of them witnessed other moving panoramas. I mean, there are several very popular ones of the Mississippi River, of views out west that actually helped to spur movement out to California in the 1850s, right, to the area a little bit south of San Francisco, and a little north of San Francisco if we're talking about the gold rush. But I'm not sure, honestly. But I would imagine that because it's such a popular cultural phenomenon of the late 1840s and 1850s, that many folks did see them, yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all of our faculty presenters. We certainly appreciate your energy. This brings us to the end of our faculty presentation part of the SU Research Day. We encourage you to stick around, have some refreshments, and visit with the folks that are in the back. Once again, thank you to all of our faculty. Let's give them another round of applause. Fascinating array of scholarship that we heard about this afternoon, and it always is really a great opportunity to hear from our faculty. Thank you so much.